All right, hello everyone. Let's go ahead and get started, especially because I have a little bit of housekeeping to do before we get started for reals. Um, so hello, welcome. I'm so excited to see so many of you. It's really great to see everyone joining from lots of places all over the world. So hello. Again, welcome. My name is Sophie Richardson. I'm a PhD student in the Yale English department. And I'm here today with my two Olio co-organizers, E. Spencer, who's at University of Iowa, and Arnaud Zimmern.
Hello, everybody.
At Notre Dame. If you have any tech issues, they'll be helping me kind of moderate and keep track of things. So send one of us a private message or an email if you're having any problems, we'll see if we can help you out. As everyone's getting situated, I just want to offer a really brief introduction to today's event, and then we'll kick off with our panelists. So I'm just going to screen share one more time. Okay, can everyone see that? All right, let's see if I can. Okay, so just a brief timeline for today. So we'll do maybe 15 minutes of introduction. That's me right now. And then Lily is going to tell us a little bit about the impetus for this panel, why skin, why women's skin in particular. Then we'll hear from all three of our panelists. The first up is Lily, and then we have Vanessa Braganza and Beatrice Bradley, and we'll introduce them properly when their presentation comes up. After all of those, we'll have a 5-minute break. Which will give you a chance to stretch and use the bathroom and eat a snack and start thinking about questions and things you want to talk about further. Then we'll go into breakout rooms for about 20 minutes, and that'll give you a chance to kind of delve deeper into whatever bits and pieces really caught your fancy. Think about how that might fit with other works you know from the period, anything goes really. Then we'll come back as a large group for about half an hour of discussion and Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. So that is our plan. A little bit on what the Olios are. The Online Olio began last year as a way to preserve some of the elements of conferences that we were missing because everything was canceled due to the pandemic. But it's also a way to try something different. So to shift the thematic focus from the big umbrella of a conference theme to really specific nodes of particular interest, and then to explore that idea from a variety of angles with a bit more time for the audience to develop and explore alongside our panelists. So we try to find speakers who will be approaching the topic from a variety of different disciplines and approaches. Today, one of our presentations is quite book historical, one's very much in the realm of gender studies, one is probably closest to history of science. And because we're online, we're also able to bring people from a much wider geographical radius while circumventing a lot of the logistical problems of travel and scheduling. And it's also important to us to bring in participants from a wide range of career stages. So you notice that we try to have our session leaders and a lot of our panelists be really early career scholars. And then among the participant names I recognize on here right now, I think I see people from first-year grad students to emeritus professors, which is exactly the kind of space that we're trying to make. So yay. And because of this emphasis on variety, we took our name as a nod to Margaret Cavendish's miscellany compilation, The World's Olio from 1655. So again, when I say we, you've been hearing my voice, but that's me and Arnaud Zimmern and E. Spencer. And we've been supported by the International Margaret Cavendish Society, as well as by Digital Cavendish. And a huge shout out to Sean Moore, who has been doing a lot of the heavy lifting on getting us on a website and helping us with all the tech angles and generally being wonderful. So thank you, Sean. And I think that's all from me, unless there are any logistical questions, which I would love you to throw in the chat. And otherwise, let's turn to Lily, who's really spearheading this session. So, and I can't see Lily's bio because I am screen sharing in such a way that I can't do it. So give me just a second. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So Lily Freeman-Jones is a second-year PhD student at Queen Mary University of London. She's funded by a principal scholarship, and her work focuses on human and animal skin in early modern drama. She's supervised by Professor Warren Boutcher and by Evelyn Welch, who is the PI for the Wellcome-funded Renaissance Skin project at King's College London, which is awesome. And I'm obsessed with it, and you guys should all check it out. Her other research interests include sensory history, medical humanities, ecocriticism, medieval miscellanies, and contemporary poetry. But today, she's going to be talking us through Like to the Indians, from Mary Wroth's sonnet sequence Pamphilia to Amphilanthus, which is inset in the Urania. So with that, I would love to turn things over to Lily and let her tell us why we're doing skin, and then tell us about her particular take on it.
Thanks so much for that, Sophie. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be here today with two scholars whose work I really admire, who've kindly agreed to help me put this panel together, just to give you guys a bit of a sense of the exciting work that's being done on women's writing on skin in the early modern period, basically. And of course, I'd like to really thank especially Sophie, without whom I would never even have heard of the Online Olios, and who helped me really lift this off the ground when I thought it might not be in the right ballpark at all for the Cavendish Society, and to Arnold and E for doing such a great job of organising. So yeah, so broadly conceived, this panel was just designed to give you guys a sense of the variety and range that there is when we look at how early modern women are writing about skin. So skin, as some of you probably know, has become quite a hot topic in recent years, beginning with a host of books that were published in the early 2000s by Claudia Benthien, Stephen Connor, and Carmen McKendrick, which looked at skin from a more history of ideas and philosophical perspective. And those were then followed by a huge upsurge of interest in skin across lots of different academic disciplines, particularly English and history. And that's only intensified as scholars look more and more at race in particular. And it's a really exciting time to be working on skin. And like Sophie said, in particular, this is kind of culminated with this huge Wellcome Trust £5 million project, with a whole team working on Renaissance skin that takes you from everything from parchment, pilgrim tattoos, and stigmata, to vegetable peelings, cheese rind, sausage skins, and tree bark. So yeah, at this moment where we're continuing to expand our understanding of skin's many meanings in the early modern period, I thought it seemed important to examine some more marginal voices, really, especially at a time where we're thinking about how we can best use the archives and amplify those voices that are often pushed out. Because women's voices and writing about skin are often kind of drowned out just because of they're so overwhelmed in comparison to the number of men writing about skin at this time. But yeah, I hope that these talks show that there are so many different ways to think about skin in the Renaissance, especially women writing about skin, and that women's writing can reveal really new, exciting insights into quite familiar contemporary concerns. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to start my presentation. Can you all see that okay? Gonna assume you can. Can't actually see you anymore now I've got rid of the Zoom, so hopefully it's fine. Great. So yeah, my talk is titled When Whiteness Fails, Roth's Faulty Complexions. What does it mean for skin to fail? This paper begins with a simple idea that skin in early modern literature is most interesting to writers when it goes wrong. So in early modern times, as in our own, the body surface spoke its own language. But what appears most often in early modern literature is not how this communication works, but how it goes wrong. In this talk, I want to focus on how skin's faulty communications are presented in a single sonnet by Mary Wroth. In this poem, Roth contrasts the white, untouched skin of her female speaker, Pamphilia, with the darkening skin of sun worshippers, to express Pamphilia's frustration at her isolation from her beloved, unlike those who can freely adore the sun god which they're worshipping in broad daylight. So Roth's sonnet thus remodels the Petrarchan trope of the pale, inert female skin which she's inherited, endowing it with a new sensitivity, even in its state of want and deprivation. In doing so, she stages a striking intervention into a poetic discourse that overwhelmingly consists of male voices narrating and correcting the failures of white female skin to signify. Whiteness may have failed within the world of the poem, but the sonnet's textual surface allows the speaker to right the wrongs of the body's surface by rewriting her own version of events where her skin could not. Skin is often positioned as a kind of text in early modern literature, from its physical affinity with paper and parchment, to the similarity of how it's examined for marks of meaning from blushes to bruises. But if skin is a text, then it can be misread or be faulty itself. Of these tropes of skin as a faulty text, perhaps none is more popular than that of white women's skin, which is the type of skin I'm going to be focusing on today. This is what Othello means when he cries of Desdemona, "Was this fair paper, this most godly book, made to write whore upon?" Othello cannot reconcile Desdemona's skin, which he describes as whiter than snow and smooth as monumental alabaster, with the infidelities she's supposed to have committed. His description of her as fair paper positions her skin as meaningful in its very blankness, a meaning which has now become deceitful, illegible, and ironic, at least in his mind. Her actions have, he thinks, defaced that blankness with a new, troubling text, almost a kind of graffiti. Her whiteness has thus failed him. But this moment, and I hope this image on the screen as well, reveals how reading skin is often actually writing skin. So we see Othello at the moment before he murders Desdemona here. And you can see his eyes looking at her face, her skin, which obviously is often very close to the bed sheets, but his hand is kind of reaching towards her, and as I'm sure most of you know, he's about to suffocate her. So in imagining he sees whore written across Desdemona's skin, Othello is engaged in a process of active inscription, not of reading what is already there. The white surface of Desdemona's skin is eclipsed by the verbal surface that's overwritten it, one that's been co-authored by Iago and Othello together. These overwritings of white female skins are predominantly governed by male voices and hands across early modern literature. Yet this imbalance begins to be reversed as greater numbers of female writers appear over the 16th and 17th centuries. One particularly striking example is offered by Mary Wroth. Educated, talented, and from one of the most foremost literary families of her time, the Sidneys, Roth was to compose two ambitious and groundbreaking works in her lifetime: the prose romance The Countess of Montgomery's Urania in 1621, and the sonnet sequence Pamphilia to Amphilanthus, written over a number of years before. The sonnet I'm focusing on today, F75, comes near the end of the manuscript version of Pamphilia, which is written from a steadfast and adoring female speaker, Pamphilia, to her erstwhile absentee lover, Amphilanthus. And the names actually mean Pamphilia means loving one and Amphilanthus means loving two. So it kind of sets up this imbalance between the two speakers that persists throughout the entire work. These poems were circulated amongst Roth's friends throughout the 1610s in manuscript form, but then she updated them and actually included them within the Countess of Montgomery's Urania as a sequence themselves. So this image is of Roth's own handwritten earlier version of Sonnet 75, but I've chosen to read out the printed version as it's the later text, and there's just, I think, 3 slight differences, mostly with turning a singular to a plural, so not major, but as Roth's latest text, I thought it was best to go with that one. I just wanted to include this amazing image of her actual handwriting here, which is in this beautiful manuscript in the folder. So this is Sonnet 75. Like to the Indians scorched with the sun which they do as their God adore, so am I used by love. Forevermore I worship him, less favour have I won. Better are they who thus to blackness run, and so can only whiteness want deplore. Then I who pale white am with grief's store, nor can have hope but to see hopes undone. Besides, their sacrifices received in sight of their true saint, mine hid as worthless right. Grant me to see where I my offerings give, then let me wear the mark of Cupid's might in heart as they in skin do Phoebus light, not ceasing offerings to love while I live. This is quite a complicated poem, so to better understand what Roth is doing here, I just want to begin by tracing its larger movements and doing a bit of recap on it. So Roth starts with quite a startling comparison. Just as the Indians who worship the sun are gradually darkened by it, so too does she receive less favour the more she venerates her own god love, which can be either Amphilanthus or the god of love himself, which is personified quite a lot throughout the sequence. The poem goes on to explain that while some worshippers, which the speaker calls Indians, more on that later, are able to venerate their god in broad daylight and proudly display the result in their skin, Pamphilia is left pale and wanting, forced to hide her adoration of her lover Amphilanthus. This extraordinary sonnet is often cited with reference to Roth's participation in Johnson's Masque of Blackness at court in 1605, where 12 female courtiers, including Roth, appeared painted as blackamoors at Queen Anne's request. This was extremely sensational at the time, especially because black skin was often signified with cloth still at this time rather than paint. So denuding the women so that they could have so much exposed skin painted was quite risque already. McManus points to how blackness was unproblematic when associated with the body of the lower class male performer, but was subversive when assumed by the female aristocratic body. But while both Roth's performance and this sonnet subvert the white female body with imagined darkness, it seems important to note that contrary to what a lot of critics have said, those darknesses are not the same. After all, as Brennan notes, Roth's poem specifically refers to Indians rather than the Ethiopians of the Masque, which was set in West Africa and populated by the daughters of Niger. I'd like to posit instead that the emphasis on sun worship makes it far more likely Roth is thinking of either the Incan sun god Inti from modern-day Peru, or the Hindu deity Surya. Roth was well-read and well-connected, and clearly kept up with global affairs, such as through her long-standing correspondence with the well-travelled ambassador Dudley Carleton. Indeed, in 1617, Anne Clifford recorded in her diary, as you can see here, that she'd spent the evening with Lady Roth, who told me a great deal of news from beyond the sea. Europeans were fascinated by the tales of sun worship that were returning from recent colonial voyages to South America, as depicted here in this hand-done drawing by Martin de Merua in his Historia General del Peru, 1616. Roth may have been inspired by her own experience in the Masque, but the reference to blackness here clearly draws on a wider pool of knowledge which deserves its own recognition. In this sonnet, Roth's equation of turning black with a kind of abuse is hardly surprising within the context of 17th century Britain, where blackness is synonymous with moral and aesthetic degradation. What is surprising, however, is the boldness of her next line, better are they who thus to blackness run. This extraordinary assertion relies on those prejudices for its power, but it's still an astonishing flight of imagination from them, even within the rhetorical confines of the poem. Roth's justification for this statement ostensibly rests on the public nature of their worship of the Indians, as she calls them, but the choice of sun worship, which plays cleverly on the poetic commonplace of the beloved as a sun, gives a vivid warmth and tactility which simmers beneath the surface of the poem. The intense heat, even pain of scorch, mingles with the relish of adore here, evoking an experience of sensual abandon situated at the skin as well as the heart. This is only more tantalizing because of its contrast with the experience of the speaker of the poem, to whom such open displays of affection are off limits. Instead, she must remain pale and wan, a word fitting in its echo of wanting. For Pamphilia is wanting not only her lover, but, as the sonnet makes clear, adequate means to worship in person. Her white skin thus becomes a heavy burden, which makes the freely burnt skins of the others she describes only the more enviable within the poem's frame. Roth's inclusion of Sunburn is well judged. It allows her to blend rhetoric, race, and sensuality. And this is partly because of the position Sunburn occupies in the early modern imagination. Hall observes it's not only a mark of racial difference in a time where environmental factors were competing alongside genetic as models of race, but also a mark of sensuality. The experience of sun on skin is often figured as an erotic contact. Sidney, Roth's own uncle, writes of Stella that the sun which others burned did her but kiss. And Roth herself echoes this when she writes of the goat herds in Urania. So white was their skin, as seen the sun in love with it, it would not hurt. Using Sunburn to contrast the white female skin of Petrarchism takes us firmly inside that skin, where too often before we've been outside it, allowing it a rare sensitivity and tactility, even if that is expressed in absence rather than presence. Unable perhaps to go as far as being blackened herself, the final stanza tries to find a kind of resolution to that absence of surface marking by resolving to wear the mark of Cupid's heart, mark of Cupid's might in heart as they in skin do Phoebus's light. This delicately weighs two very different forms of effective encounter across internal and external surface, but the scales tip off balance. The first half lands heavily with mark and might connoting a weightiness that distends across the enjambment. By contrast, the succinct as they in skin do Phoebus's light benefits from the sense of completion as it fulfills the rhyme, but it also carries the ineffable, powerful lightness of wearing light in your very skin, a powerful and original early modern reimagining of what it might mean to be Black. But if the speaker ultimately seems to find her white skin unsatisfactory in its appearance and sensations, then perhaps there's a redemption of sorts to be found in that old analogy between paper and skin. Kim F. Hall has argued that the sun in this poem can stand for a male literary tradition, with the worshippers who the speaker envies figuring male Petrarchan poets who can take for granted their immersion in a literary tradition in a way that Roth cannot. Keeping women white, she writes, as in unexposed to literary tradition, serves to keep the female subjugated without access to the copier necessary for invention. Hall's analysis is insightful, and her connection of the whiteness of skin with a blank slate of poetic invention particularly acute. But is the speaker in this poem fully subjugated? Even if, within the world of the poem, the display of love Pamphilia desires is barred from her, the very existence of the text testifies and in some way displays that love, even as it laments the stagnancy of its expression. Let me wear the mark of Cupid's might in heart, sighs Pamphilia, not ceasing offerings to love while I live. Love and living have become synonymous here, but both rest upon the act of making offerings. And those offerings ultimately can only be the words themselves, the poems that Pamphilia writes. Gavin Alexander, who's written extensively on Roth and the Sidneys, muses that the taking on of voices in poetry, as Roth does with Pamphilia, signifies ultimately that it's impossible to distinguish selfhood from the words we speak. And in that, perhaps the poem finds a way out. Pamphilia's white skin may be unmarked, but the white paper is no longer, and in doing so, it testifies to the experiences far more permanently than skin ever could. This is a sonnet that thinks deeply about skin's ability to testify, to mediate between inner and outer, but ultimately finds that ability wanting in favour of paper's own ability to do just that. So for Roth, whiteness's failings are just the beginning of paper's possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. I have so many thoughts and questions. I'm very excited to ask you later. If everyone could scribble all of your thoughts down excitedly now, and then we will turn to our next presenter. Let me just grab that for you, Lily. Okay. All right, Lily, are you seeing my screen?
I am, that's great, yeah. So next up, we've got Vanessa Braganza giving her talk First Impressions. So Vanessa is a book historian, literary critic at Harvard. She's best known for discovering and decoding the sole surviving book from Mary Wroth's library, Her writing has appeared in a range of academic and public venues, including Smithsonian Magazine, and is forthcoming in the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Women Writers and the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Early Modern Women's Writing. She's curating an exhibit opening at Harvard's Houghton Library in spring 2022 on women authors authorizing themselves. Today, Vanessa will be focusing on decorative bookbinding and specifically women's monograms.
Thanks so much for the intro, Lily.
All right, Vanessa, just grab your PowerPoint.
We'll just get the PowerPoint up, yeah. All right, lovely. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So I'll be talking about first impressions, impressive women, and impressionable skin. Women's literary and cultural activities throughout the 16th and 17th centuries are of many different complexions, but that's not how they're usually represented in early modern texts. "Leave idle books alone," Edward Denny snaps at Lady Mary Wroth in 1621 when she publishes the Urania. "For wise and worthier women have written none." He is a man in print, and 'tis enough he hath undergone oppressing, yet not like a lady. This is Anthony Scholliker, who in the early 17th century writes derisively of an author reluctant to appear in print. Some people will be familiar with this quotation. It opens Wendy Wool's monograph, The Imprint of Gender. Printing or pressing is a common sexual metaphor in this period. And it's always the woman's part to be pressed upon or imprinted by the man. We are gold in our own natures pure, but when we suffer, the husbands stamp upon us then, alas, and base ones of you men are mingled with us and make us blush like copper, says the character Maria in the play The Woman's Prize, John Fletcher's 17th century continuation of The Taming of the Shrew. This image combines the imagery of stamping an impression upon a precious metal with polluting it with impurities by mixing it with a base metal. So here's a question we should always be asking ourselves. How does the early modern period represent itself, impress itself upon our attention? A couple of takeaways from these quotes I've started with. Women shouldn't be writers, so says Denny, and women are the malleable sex or gender, the coin, the paper, whose role is to receive the physical and cultural imprint of men. Skin is a common metaphoric vehicle for this, and here doubles, right, with those printing and pressing metaphors and the coinage, the precious metal image as well of the stamped coin. Anyone who has ever enjoyed the sound of music will be thinking of the line, "Your life, little girl, is an empty page that men will want to write on." But we're one step further than that. Little girl, you are the empty page. Think back to Lily's quote from Othello with the word whore writ upon Desdemona. But understanding our period accurately depends on us driving a wedge between two questions. On the one hand, the question that I've already posed, how does the early modern period represent itself or impress itself upon our attention? On the other hand, how does this representation compare with what we can discern is actually going on in the period? Denny's remark is a good example, right? It doesn't ring with historical truth to us anymore. The past half century of scholarship has unearthed plenty of unwise women by his standard, and will continue to turn up more women writers as time goes on. So this tells us something really important. The early modern period's impression of itself as regards gender is not to be taken at face value. As literary critics and historians, one of our most pressing tasks is to be able to distinguish between a period's impression of itself and the relationship of that impression to actual events. This is what I tell people constantly: question, 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 the way the period is presenting itself. So who is actually pressing or being impressed upon? So glad you asked. As it turns out, there are some impressive women in an area which heavily inflects both literature and history, but isn't actually often looked at. And it's also, fittingly enough, an area in which women are literally stamping their impressions on a different kind of skin: leather bookbinding. So your impression of leather bindings may well be that they're the work of men. Embroidered bookbindings are what women produce and deal in. After all, you all watched the video I pre-circulated on gold tooling. It involves workshop labor, not a domestic set of skills. And this sort of professional craftsmanship wasn't socially permitted women. Men do the pressing. Women's marks are found in the products of a sanctioned female activity. Next slide, please. Nope. This is a book penned by one woman and bound by another. Here's the backstory. After his fortunes plummeted following the collapse of the Virginia Company, and this is in 1626, businessman Nicholas Farrar, better known as George Herbert's literary executor, packed up his family and moved them to Little Gidding in Cambridgeshire, where they established a devout community organized around strict daily observance of the Book of Common Prayer. They also established a bindery staffed by Farrar's nephews and nieces, and actually instructed by a woman, a Cambridge bookbinder's daughter, as yet unidentified. The women in particular grew famous for their bindings. Thomas Fuller, contemporary writer, wrote in his book, The Worthies of England, 1662, that the so-called Little Gidding nuns, their needles were, quote, employed in learned and pious work to bind Bibles, end quote. For the longest time, modern bibliographers and book dealers interpreted needles, in this quote, to mean that the women were doing decorative needlework, embroidery. Here's the thing. Every extant confirmed book made by the Little Gidding bindery is leather. The needles were employed in actually stitching the quires together. This manuscript collection of extracts from scripture by Farrar's niece, Joyce Collett, was bound in olive morocco, that's goat skin, and tooled by his other niece, Joyce's sister, Mary Collett. I want you to look at this as more than an attractive piece of artistry. If we're going to get the right impression from this object, we need to look at the designs pressed into the leather as information to be deciphered. We need to know how to read these sorts of marks on skin. Here's some of the questions I start with when I first see a binding, and that I want you to ask yourselves as well, and possibly also in your groups. First, what does the style of the binding tell me about the object? This is what we call a centerpiece style. You can see it's organized around a central decoration, but it's made up of small tools, which is very in keeping with the 17th century influence of French luxury bindings, right? It's not just one piece of metal that's being pressed into the leather here, it's several, and I'm going to show that to you a bit later. So this is a very in fashion object, very in keeping with the French luxury binding styles of the time. What does that tell us? It's not a homespun object. It's not embroidered in the home. It's not made for personal use. The Little Gidding women, as Thomas Fuller's quote actually suggests to us, were very well known. They bound collages called harmonies. They bound books for Charles I, the Duke of York, and George Herbert as well. They were actually very well known, and they had an upmarket clientele. So question number one, what does the style tell me about the object? In this case, it says upmarket clientele. Question number two, do I see any inconsistencies here? Slide, please. So one thing to know about English binding, and more generally in this period, is that sometimes it has asymmetries and oddities of execution. You'll notice that around that central decoration, we have these dots, right, organized in what's supposed to be a diamond sort of lozenge shape. But you see the arrows pointing to one row of 4 dots that's angled slightly incorrectly, disrupts the diamond shape. That's actually very typical of English execution in this period, and it's not particularly female. John Bateman, royal bookbinder to Charles I, has similar awkwardnesses in his bindings with small individual tools. if you ask me during the general questioning, I'm happy to show you pictures of those. So do I see inconsistencies? Do any tools not match here? Maybe something has been tampered with. Is there anything here that's out of place? Is always a good question to ask. Next slide, please. And the last question, as I mentioned before, right, this is a binding that's organized around a centerpiece style, but uses many different pieces of metal. And this is now, will make sense to you from the video that you've already watched. This is made up of many individual pieces of metal pressed into the binding. It's a very labor-intensive kind of binding. We call it a semi-binding, S-E-M-I-S, meaning made up of small tools. So the last question one asks of a binding is, how many decorative tools, how many actual pieces of metal can I tell were used to produce this? This gives you a sense of labor and skill, and here fairly obviously quickly dispels the idea that women were unskilled in a traditionally male trade. This is only, you know, for there are many more, but I've highlighted 4 of the immediately obvious decorations here. You've got a spiral, you've got a diamond, we have leaves, we have a different kind of diamond design around the outer edge of the boards. Collections of tools can also help you to identify binders. So I don't actually think this has been done for the Little Giving binder, at least not in recent years, to identify what were the collection of tools. Can we consolidate the ornaments that they had in their workshop? Because that can help to identify future bindings by them. Slide, please. So I want to finish with an example that by now is probably familiar to many people in this audience, of a woman making her mark through a binding. I'm referring to one of my best friends in the rare book world, Lady Mary Wroth's monogrammed copy of Xenophon's Cyropedia. This is the same book I found a couple of years ago. In contrast to Like to the Indian, in which Roth uses the metaphor of skin color to represent the way that unreciprocated love is acting upon her, the monogram on this volume is actually Roth's way of using that same experience of being acted upon to make a reciprocal mark on others. The symbol decodes to the names Pamphilia and Amphilanthus, 2 of Roth's characters from her romance, the Urania. They're also fictional avatars for herself and her extramarital lover, William Herbert. On this book, bound after Herbert's death, the monogram also alludes to a 3rd character in the Urania named Fair Design, an allegorical knight who embodies both the monogram and her illegitimate son by Herbert, also named William. So the symbol and its literary reference here suggest that young William's features, first of all, may have borne the stamp of his father. He certainly bore the name of his father. And they also press the unwilling father figure together with the ending of the Urania to acknowledge or decode his son. So this is a way of using that physical impression on skin to signify maybe a visual echo between father and son, and to press the father to take a certain kind of action and lament the action not taken as well. Let's have one final turn of the slide. So I want to just leave you with a couple of questions for ways to move forward with this. What else, and I would love people to discuss this in the groups, what else might book bindings change about our impressions, the impressions we derive of women's literary activity from the way this period represents itself? And then come at the same line of questioning from the other direction, what other impressions about women's literary activity do we take for granted, do we derive from early modern representations? What other methods might we use to question these? These might be book history, they might be other methods of historical investigation. So I'd love for people to think more about those questions as we go into the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I am so excited for the Q&A. I think we're going to have so much to talk about. But first, we have one more presentation, which I'm also very excited about, which is Beatrice. Let me just share a different screen, and then Lily, you can have the floor. Let's see, am I sharing this? I have an ominous feeling it's not working. Lily, are we seeing Beatrice?
Yeah, we are. Yeah, it's in the PowerPoint view, but we could just do it. I feel it's not that big a deal, is it? So Beatrice Bradley is a humanities teaching fellow at the University of Chicago, where she also received her PhD in English in 2020. Her current book project, Sweat: Residues of Embodiment in the Early Modern World, considers how literary texts mobilize processes of repair following the cultural trauma of illness. She charts the literary aftermath of the sweating sickness, a plague that spread across England in the 15th and 16th centuries, and examines histories of waste and identity formation more broadly. Her previous work has appeared in Milton Studies and English Literary Renaissance. Today, she'll be looking at rejuvenation in Margaret Cavendish's Blazing World.
Thank you so much, Lily. All right, I will share my screen. Okay. All right, there we go. Everyone can see this. We're all set. Okay, wonderful. First and foremost, thank you, Sophie, Arnaud, and Eve, so much for all your organizational work and for putting together this great series. And thank you, Lily, for proposing this particular topic, which obviously I am biased, but I find so exciting. And it's just delightful to hear about. Sophie, Vanessa, and Lily and I have had such lovely conversations over the past 2 months, and I'm just very thankful for this opportunity. This is exciting. So today I'll be talking about flesh. Okay. Cavendish ends Grounds of Natural Philosophy. In fact, she ends the appendix to Grounds of Natural Philosophy with a speculative account of what she labels restoring beds, comma, or wombs. The parts of her mind debate the existence of such beds in the world, the bed's purpose being, as the name indicates, to restore creatures to their former condition of life. Cavendish compares this objective with the more quotidian rejuvenation of vegetal life, observing, a dry and withered root of some vegetable, although the parts of vegetable be, as we say, dead, yet they are often restored by the means of some arts. Also, dead sprigs will, by art, receive new life. Throughout this final section, Cavendish emphasizes the restoring beds process as natural, as opposed to by art, and she not only refers to them repeatedly as wombs, but also once compares the bed to the stomach. In response to the question whether the restoring bed was a fleshy bed, the parts of Cavendish's mind reach agreement that they were like flesh, for softness or sponginess, as also for color. The reference to color suggests skin, the flesh tone peach of a Crayola box that stands in for universal whiteness, only for Cavendish's series of metaphors to move inside the body. The bed was somewhat like the stomach of a human creature, or of the like animal, that could open and shut the orifice. And when an animal creature was put into the restoring bed, it would immediately enclose the animal. And when it had caused a perfect restoration, the restoring bed would open itself and deliver to its own liberty. The fleshy beds, seemingly closer to organs than the flesh we touch and recognizably inhabit in daily life, bring to mind the well-known floating wombs of early modern medical texts. There we go. And yet, Cavendish ultimately reorients or perhaps even rejects our attempts to visualize her restoring beds, concluding this section with a description of them as a clustered group. The center of the whole universe was the sea, and in the center of the sea was a small island, and in the center of the island was a creature like in outward form to a great and high rock. This rock creature was all covered with its own productions. These various productions were restoring beds. And I became fixated enough with the sort of impossibility of this image. I asked an artist friend of mine, I gave her this paragraph and was like, represent it as you would. And it's really science fiction-y is what she came up with. I showed it to a colleague and they compared it to Cronenberg's Fly and sort of what it evokes. So Cavendish's theorization of flesh in this section at once familiarizes the reader, acting as a stabilizing visual signifier, and renders the bed outside our full conception. The metaphor, they were like flesh in softness, sponginess, and color, promises a familiar scope of reference in life, only to refuse such familiarity by turning to the womb, then the stomach, and finally, the rocky creature from which the organs are suspended. Cavendish has framed this tend toward alienation from the start with her own disbelief repeating prior to the appendix her doubts on restoration, only to conclude with an extensive account thereof. The movement between flesh as at once a marker of familiarity and unfamiliarity resurfaces in Butler, retroactively illuminating the move in Cavendish. In Butler's Dawn, the word flesh exists easily in translation for Lilith, a Black American woman, and Jediah, an extraterrestrial Oankali being, and yet remains distinctly divided between the categories human and alien. Jediah informs Lilith that the spaceship is flesh, only to immediately continue, more like mine than yours. What flesh does in Butler is not only move, ripple, writhe, and indeed widen into a hole like the orifices of Cavendish's restoring beds, but it also positions the creatures within the ship, both human and non-human, as materially similar to the ship itself, different only in degree, more or less like. The insistent fleshiness in both texts gathers importance in positioning the respective encasements as womb-like, despite, as I suggest, flesh being an uncertain signifier for accustoming the reader to envision an encounter with the womb, and apologies for this, in the flesh. What does the sponginess of a womb feel like? This brings me to my central question of this short talk. Why, in both dystopic and utopic accounts of life extension, which so often negate the necessity of childbearing and instead produce, as Cavendish phrases it in Grounds, mature adult bodies, why do these accounts nevertheless reproduce the material conditions of birth? By which I mean the womb and the suggestion of amniotic fluid, but also the gradual progression of an unformed or forming body situated in gestational time, 9 months, 10 months, until we reach, as Cavendish phrases it, delivery. The Blazing World, which predates the 1668 publication of Grounds by 2 years, includes an account of restoration similar to the later text, albeit the revitalization of a body not after death, but in old age. The imperial race, the ruling population of the Blazing World, has orchestrated their own extended lifespan of several hundred years, rendering old age a disease state for which they have discovered the, quote, cure. When the Empress inquires of the ape men, the hybrid creatures in the occupation of chemists, the means of said cure, whether it was by nature or a special divine blessing, the ape men inform her of a medicinal gum produced by a rock or philosopher's stone. When administered to those of advanced years, the gum provokes a violent reaction in the body. It being given every day for some certain time to an old decayed man in the bigness of a little pea will first make him spit for a week or more. After this, it will bring forth vomits, humors of several colors. The elderly subject, or rather the patient, at last begins to vomit out his nose as the gum, quote, works upon his brain. The purgation continues over several months, and when it at last concludes, the ape men promise that the old decayed man will appear at the age of 20, both in shape and strength. Cavendish clearly positions restoring beds as sharing an objective, the prolongation of life, with the ape men's account of the, quote, gum. Cavendish dwells in the physicality of the process. Then the ingested gum will purge by stool, then by urine, then by sweat, and lastly by bleeding at the nose and the hemorrhoids, all which effects it will perform within the space of 6 weeks or a little more, for it does not work very strongly, but gently and by degrees. Lastly, when it has done all this, it will make the body break out into a thick scab and cause both hair, teeth, and nails to come off, which scab, being arrived to its full maturity, opens first along the back and comes off all in a piece like armor. And all this is done within the space of 4 months. After this, the patient is wrapped into a cerecloth, prepared of certain gums and juices, wherein he continues until the time of 9 months be expired from the first beginning of the cure, which is the time of a child's formation in the womb. After the cerecloth is taken away, he will appear at the age of 20, both in shape and strength. This is a remarkable scene of metamorphosis, to put it mildly, a scene that is at once explicitly larval and fetal. The language's formal excess suggests a humorous delight or authorial pleasure in this extended process of purgation. The old decayed man provides an exaggerated, even campy performance of aging. He reaches a zenith of leaky abjection, vomiting profusely, losing all his hair and teeth, even his nails, before ultimately entering into proximity with the infant. The lines, like the rock-like creature that appears at the ends of grounds, test the capacities of our imagination by taking a familiar topic, the health benefits of purgation, oft heralded in early modern medical texts, and exaggerating it both in process and results. And yet embedded within the humor of this passage is an account of life extension where a portion of the population has access to a resource that prolongs life for apparently centuries. If the biopolitical function of reproduction is to uphold a dominant, self-replacing body, reproduction through childbearing here is made unnecessary. The body of the imperial race is not just reproducing itself, but enacting a fantasy of endurance. It is worth noting that for all its similarities and its shared aims with the restoring beds, this passage does not include a single reference to flesh, nor for that matter, skin. Elsewhere in the blazing world, flesh appears as a synonym for bestial, in opposition to and paired with fish, and Cavendish only uses skin twice in the text, once in reference to a vegetable and once to a horse. And also thinking sort of about the constellation of words that are appearing across these talks, she uses complexion when she's famously talking about the different people who are like, some are purple colored, some are azure colored. There she uses the word complexion. The old man's body is, I would suggest, pointedly without flesh and without skin, desiccated and decayed in Cavendish. The scab temporarily takes the place of the wombic enclosure of the restoring bed before being exchanged with a cerecloth, indeed synthetic skin. The ingested substance offers no easy nor immediate rejuvenation. Instead, the process extends across time, making demands not only of the old man's body, but also the unknown caretakers, the hands that wrap the cerecloth, prepare the juices, which I would read as sort of an administered amniotic fluid, and take the cloth away. The old man is situated within a gestational time frame of 9 months, echoed in grounds where the process of restoration occurs over 10 months because, quote, a human creature was not fully ripe for birth before the time of 10 months. So perhaps the resurrection of a dead body requires an extra month of reparative efforts, or perhaps this is just a signaling or gesture to the uncertain time frame of pregnancy. What this particular fantasy grants us as readers is what happens to the body in the process of restoration, according to Cavendish, precisely that which the fleshy beds withhold from view. The old man regenerates his own flesh and skin, not the thick scab which arrives in metaphor, like in armor, precisely in the moment the object of comparison fails and breaks open, but that which goes unsaid, that which is revealed beneath the scab when it arrived to its full maturity. As Cavendish notes at the end of the appendix, the fleshy beds of grounds do not hold the capacity to decay, a reminder that they are only like flesh, invulnerable as the plastic quality of Butler's ship. In thinking through the capacities of restoring beds to gather scattered or dismembered bodies, Cavendish compares the bones of the animal to roots that can be coaxed back to life. The comforting parts of her mind observe, in all probability, the bones were the roots, and the bones being the roots, if that bare carcass of a man should be put into a restoring bed, all the fleshy and spongy parts, both those that were the exterior and those that were the interior, so again, we have a fleshiness that is moving from the skin all the way into the organs. Those would spring and increase to the full maturity. In this formulation, flesh is an infinitely renewable resource. It is simultaneously the marker of time, progression, and realization. In closing, I want to suggest that the insistent flagging of gestational time for Cavendish offers a way of thinking about embodiment in the episodic. Maturity in grounds refers to a creature who has arrived to a state of, quote, perfection. Cavendish promises that those that were restored should return to perfection by degrees, continuing to explain how persons in advanced stage would return to a preceding form, whereas others who died young would advance to it. Both youth and age shall meet in perfection. Perfection in early modern English suggests completion and maturity, here the completion of a life form from infancy into adulthood, rather than flawlessness. This articulation in grounds nevertheless positions the majority of life stages as deviant, oriented around a brief, fleeting window, forever looking back or forever anticipating a more desirable form of being, perhaps the single year of 20. The old man of the blazing world never arrives at this promised state. Indeed, perhaps the fullest account of embodiment we receive in the text lingers in gestational time, tracking the disruptions of the body, degree by degree, and provides us with a way of thinking about embodiment in which its seeming failures, the way in which a body that deviates from how we regularly inhabit it can render our own flesh unfamiliar, are non-continuous and non-linear, but instead episodic. The old man may occupy a teleology oriented toward perfection. He will appear at the age of 20, but he never quite reaches the futurity of that will. In doing so, Cavendish revises the understanding of old age and sick bodies as inherent endpoints, instead reminding us how often we experience the body as episodic, looking towards some future time in which we will feel better, more awake, less tired, or fearing the onset of a tickle in the throat, a scratchy breath, decline. She reminds the reader how the body in upheaval or stasis can both be temporary conditions, how to be embodied is to vacillate in and out of comprehension, and that all flesh is just a scab waiting to form. Thank you.
Final part of the Olios, sad to say. I know you're all having so much fun. It's kind of dreadful to even start saying the word this final part. But is really meant as a much larger sharing of what happened inside the breakout rooms, and then a further exploration. And it can be guided either by just pure intellectual curiosity, or it can be more pragmatic in the sense that we can start exploring maybe perhaps what we want to bring into our own classrooms or into our own published research, things like that seemed extremely valuable from the Olios. It can also, it historically has happened that we actually want to start opening up possibilities for a new thread of study within Cavendish and women writers more entirely, and revise how we even talk about the core concept that we're talking about. So if you want to actually start a revolution, this might also be the right forum for it. So with that said, I think, are we still expecting a few more? Is that all of us here?
I think we're all back out of breakout rooms.
Fantastic. In that case, I think, Lily, do you want to take over moderating the larger discussion? Maybe we'll just start by having a representative from each panel just kind of quickly debrief what they talked about. But would you mind taking over, Lily?
Yeah, sure, no, thank you. I'm hearing something about some amazing images from Anna, so maybe we could start with that group. I'd love to, if someone is brave enough to volunteer. Or I mean, you can all pitch in as well.
Caitlin, can I pick on you? And what are these fun images that are still loading on my computer?
Yeah, we were just talking about whether or not like the bookbinding or the embroidery was ever used in order to kind of obscure imperfections within the animal skin, and I brought up some examples of like medieval manuscripts where they would use embroidery in order to kind of cover up imperfections in the actual parchment, and a lot of times they would after the embroidery they would add illuminations around the embroidery in order to try to bring the kind of imperfections of the skin like into the manuscript, and it actually becomes like almost part of the commentary on the manuscript. So that was just one of the things that we were looking at.
Wow, that's literally amazing. Thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah, I think ages ago on Twitter, someone was sharing a really cute example of this that looked just like like a Frankenstein kind of scar. So it literally just looked like sewing up actual skin, like human skin, I guess. Yeah, it is amazing, isn't it? Like, also the durability of these objects. It's no wonder that they were making these kind of efforts to repair them. I only recently found out that the UK stopped writing its laws on vellum 7 years ago. So every new law that the government was coming up with was being written down on actual vellum, and they've only just switched to this kind of vegetable substitute. So it's interesting to think about, the hold that these materials have and the permanence of animal skin. It's just amazing, isn't it? Someone also had a freaky hairy book that they shared on Twitter, I think, that was very scary.
That's also making me think, Lily, in our room, towards the end, we were talking about tattooing as another way of writing kind of interpenetrated with the skin and sort of needles, a different kind of needlework that was making me think too about sewing leather, sewing skin, like Vanessa was talking about sewing the quires. And also we were Oh, and we were also earlier had sort of a thread going on aging and immortality, rejuvenation, sort of like Beatrice, but also thinking about what the page is in terms of how durable it is, but also I was kind of thinking, you know, how durable it isn't, and that skin does age in a way that, you know, stone or marble or glass or something like that doesn't. So it's very durable, but also fragile. And that seems sort of like an interesting combination. I'll stop talking now that I'm just briefly reporting on our group, but I would also love to hear a little bit about what the other groups talked about.
So I was in the group with Vanessa and Lily. So it was some really interesting and exciting materials that we talked about. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was this sort of tension between the decorative books that were created by women and or made more elaborate by women versus the pressure that women often felt not to themselves be ornate, right? And so we talked a little bit about that, and I think we determined that there's some room for additional research and some exciting approaches. So I don't know if Caitlin or Vanessa would like to talk a little bit about that, but it was a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, there was a wonderful sort of theme in our group is there anything troubled about the idea of decorated animal skin? Tara had a wonderful question. Is there ever an ethos of wanting to obscure skin with decoration in bindings? And it's kind of curious in a way that it's not an impulse in the period, even when you get, right, you know, the most temporary of wrappers like vellum wrappers, skin is kind of shown off. Or a hot commodity, a luxury commodity on book bindings. And then also this line of questioning about decoration, like, is it analogous to, right, the criticism of women's makeup, that you have these just very luxurious things, right? Do we mistrust appearances? I thought that was I hadn't thought about that. It's a very fruitful avenue for research, I think.
That's really interesting, Vanessa. It reminds me of this bit I actually wanted to include in the talk, but didn't because of time, from a Donne poem that's about you know, the really famous to his mistress going to bed one, and he says like full nakedness all joys are due to the like books gay coverings made, all women thus arrayed, but they're kind of mystic books when they really show themselves to us in full nakedness, basically. And this idea of clothes and everything being this kind of covering, and then the text being inside. And I think there's this real vacillation always between the enticement of the covering and this kind of repulsion from it and distrust of it as well, which maybe came across in kind of all of our talks a little bit. I don't know if you've got anything more to share about, like, especially with your work on bindings and everything, how that works.
In terms of sort of books as clothing?
Yeah, just in terms of, like, whether you've ever come across anything that's criticizing these elaborate bindings, or especially in the context of women's work, I suppose, whether that ever comes up in a gendered way, whether it's like they can tool the outside but not read the inside. Sorry.
I think no, this is a great question. So in terms of bindings, the answer, funnily enough, so far in my research has been no, and it's this peculiar exception, not only to the way that sort of women and appearances and luxurious appearances are usually regarded with suspicion, but also to this supposed Protestant shift, right, away from objects that we can fixate upon. You know, we were talking a bit about embroidered girdle books, right? You know, and embroidered bindings that would match a woman's gloves and gauntlets, or you know, be accompanied by a very luxurious embroidered bag as well. And there seems to be this exception made for these luxury objects, that it's okay to carry these, it's even fashionable to carry these. In a different context, Helen Smith has a wonderful essay about a corrupted text of mid-16th century play. I will put the title in the chat when I find it after I make this remark. But this idea of a corrupted play text, she takes from it's Gorboduc. It's a corrupt printing of Gorboduc, that's referred to as corrupted, and as a kind of the Roth's metaphor is used as a kind of loose woman that's been ravished, that's been corrupted. And then when the text is reprinted in corrected form, it's as though it's wearing, the metaphor is revised, it's as though it's been clothed properly and modestly. So that's not to do with bindings, but it's interesting that that metaphor does get applied to the inside of a book, to the text itself.
If I can jump in there at that moment, because we did notice also that in the Roth poem, she talks about wearing the mark of Cupid's might, which also suggests a kind of clothing. So in our group, which was with Diana and Arnaud and Miriam and myself, we talked about the theme of, we talked about the sort of dynamic of visibility and invisibility as applied to race. Diana was very interested in that idea. Blackness is visible and whiteness is invisible. And we also talked, and I think it's been touched upon already, about temporality, about skin as being on the one hand something that can rejuvenate itself, but on the other hand something that is subject to aging, and that in some of these expressions or some of these women's writing, skin is a flat surface that is impressed upon or that is permanently marked, whereas in other cases it is like in the Cavendish case, I suppose skin is more a container for the flesh that is within it. And so we have this sort of, I guess, confusing temporality. Like if skin is paper, then you mark it permanently. If it's a binding, any kind of the gold tooling or the impression upon it is sort of almost a violent mark that's being made on it, and that will stay. But now I'm thinking about the repairing, which kind of complicates things, because then something is marked but subsequently covered up in some kind of way. So that's another possibility there. But in the Cavendish perception, the skin is something that contains a process of rejuvenation or sort of reversing time. So, and then Miriam does research on women and handwriting. So that was very interesting to have that idea brought in of women as being capable of certain types of handwriting, but not others. You know, certain hands were supposed to be more, usually the Italian hand, more suitable to women, and other hands are not, which I guess sort of reminds us of the idea of marking on paper as a kind of doing something that requires physical strength, or a kind of violent marking of the body, of a paper body, I suppose. Oh, we haven't even talked about paper bodies in this group. I'm just thinking of paper ones. Okay, I'll stop there. If any of my group want to add to that, I think.
Well, I'm seeing a hand from Delilah, and then yeah, and then I would love to hear from you on the dimensional stuff.
Just what Martina was saying, of course, was sparking a lot of memories of how Cavendish really equated her own self with her texts, and this rejuvenation was very central to a lot of her rhetoric, especially in the moment of sort of the phoenix-like emerging. And she actually said at one point very clearly that I'd rather all my books be burned than they be misunderstood. And so I think there was a sense of her own misunderstanding that she was so struggling to repeating herself in various ways so that she would be clearly understood. And so there's a real equation of self with body, and of course the paper bodies has been discussed. But this whole rejuvenation of the skin and the flesh and the book with revision and constant revision and editing is a theme that runs across all of these. I was talking in our group about that what I've been working on mostly now is poisons and a lot of the materials that Cavendish was discussing in terms of unguents and salves and stuff, which do go on the skin. And a lot of poisons are ingested through the skin, for whether they be lips or dresses, or all the motifs we got in the drama. And I do wonder if there's a connection between a lot of the chemistry that went on to making these books, and perhaps Vanessa would know more about this than I do, in that there is a chemical processes even to just dealing with the vellum and dealing with that stuff. And there's a sense of paper being poisonous. I just was wondering, that was jumping at me. Sorry to throw this in another direction.
No, I think definitely I'd love to hear from Vanessa. My connection that I was making, Delilah, when you were talking, was actually with the gum from Beatrice's, and thinking about that as kind of, it sounds pretty toxic, but actually it's rejuvenating and it seems really violent, but don't worry, no one feels any pain. So anyway, I was wondering, Beatrice, I'd love to hear a little bit about your group, and if you have thoughts on poisons or 2D, 3D skins or anything that we've been, spiraling about.
No, I mean, so sort of towards the end of our conversation, Marina turned us towards thinking about how Cavendish's like own, as in her writing, as Delilah's talking about, but also in her body, like her own self-fashioning through purgation and like forms of self-care, and how those sort of are pairing off, and like how she herself is sort of thinking of herself as always in a changing state that might be advancing towards like a better form of that being, both materially in her body and on the page, which of course that sort of movement between the paper and the physical body really resonated with the other talks today. We were also thinking about sort of animal, and obviously, I mean, vellum is obviously pointing us in that direction too, about how sort of human skin, like the word skin to us might signify human, but how it brings sort of this constant proximity into the animal, and sort of as does flesh, and as does all these sort of, this constellation of vocabulary we've been talking about, and how, and what exactly that's doing. And then we also spent a lot of time talking about scabs and thinking about sort of, if a womb is so fleshy and spongy, a scab is not that. And it made me really, I was curious, I don't know if Lily's group got to this with Poulter, but we were thinking about sort of, Cavendish elsewhere talks about how the scab on the skin, when you're sort of covered in scabs and like you have sores that are outbreaking, and the scab's a really positive sign, right? It shows that you're healing. If you don't have a scab, something's wrong, something's going off, not according to plan. And so thinking about it as a mark instead of an encasement was sort of, again, I think it's showing how Cavendish is sort of vacillating in and out of perspectiveship. But it made me really curious also about how Lily was thinking about Poulter's markings of her daughter, obviously, in a really sort of tragic context, but it made me think about that additional poem that you shared.
I just want to take a moment to point out some really fascinating comments and shared resources in the chat. Discussions of, skin versus flesh versus complexion. There were brought up the issue with Erin Griffey and unguents. And of course, Arno shared The American Moor a bit on a recent play. And then Sophie just wanted to follow up, Beatrice, and see if you could clarify if we know what sense the word gum had in the early modern period. Was it just gum, or was it like the dental gum?
Yeah, it's primarily sticky substances. And what it's now making me think about, I got disoriented from the question of poison, but what it makes me think about is in Comus, right? And in Comus, it's gum that sticks, it's sort of this sticky gum that freezes her in place. And my students always want to like think about it as a mouth. But it's again, it's sort of showing the suggested toxicity or sort of the dangerous implications of like how it can render a body, and that it can sort of, Cavendish imagines it as this explosion, but it's interesting to think about how, for Milton, it's this really sudden, it binds the skin to the marvelous surface in Comus. So definitely is sort of toggling sort of a medicinal, healthful purpose and something that could be poisonous or dangerous for ingestion.
I do think it toggles a little bit between that sort of ooziness and stasis in Cavendish, when she describes you find this stuff in like a desert rock and you have to like carefully warm it so it liquefies, and then you eat it, and then you basically liquefy, but like also scab over. So there is this weird, like, does it make things more rigid? Is it stony, or is it like flowing out of all your orifices at once in every single color and flavor? That's a great passage. Yeah, did you want to?
No, I was just gonna agree, and I think it's just another way in which this sort of like familiarizing metaphor, or this way that we're sort of brought into the text, and it's made, oh, it's Paracelsis's balm. We know what a balm is. Like, it's this very positive thing. Is all of a sudden taken and sort of made very alien to us. So I think that distinction you're drawing is exactly right.
I just really quickly add that we'd never know exactly how that gum is applied. We don't know if it's something you take orally or if it's something you apply on the skin. And a lot of that kind of uncertainty is really powerful from on Cavendish's part, I think, because there'd be so much interest, I think, from the part of like any of her readers to really try to like nail down what this is and see what it looks like. And she really does kind of take that away from you, which goes back to Beatrice's point about like this being a moment of fantasy, more than it is perhaps, it's a moment of fantasy embedded with all of the intellectual, cultural, and social history of that period. But at the end of the day, how it's supposed to be read is almost not, it's almost etherealized from the body. So you get this moment of really graphic, kind of skinny fleshiness, but it also kind of takes you away from that whole medicinal therapeutical content by being so vague about how the whole thing even begins, right? The beginnings being delicate. The thing that we talked about in our little group also that was super helpful was a more longitudinal kind of question of like, what is skin in this period if it serves both as something that you're constantly impressing on like a flat surface, and I think this was Martine's really good point, but on the other hand, it can be like in Cavendish, the kind of containing bag for all of the flesh and guts. So the pressures from inside and outside coming in on skin are really fascinating, kind of external and external. Martine, did you want to add more to that? Because I know you've been thinking about it. Hester Polter's poem is still on your mind. I really wanted to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I was thinking about in Hester Polter. I mean, I have to look at the poem again, but the idea there that the disease is not something that is on the inside and then causes these marks to arise on the outside, but that they're sort of imposed on the outside on the skin. So that it's marking it from the outside. That was an interesting way in which it was more aligned with the skin as flat surface notion than the skin as a container of spongy flesh, possibly rejuvenated from the outside. I guess it's a way to make the disease legible, or the causes of the disease as not internal to her, the virginal body. It's a soiling of the body. So it's sort of an erotic impression on the body almost, a soiling of the virgin body. She talks a lot about the virginity of her daughter in that poem.
Oh, yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, Martine. I think that's such a good point, because I was thinking about earlier this Porter poem that I shared. I'm not sure if everyone probably hasn't read it, but yeah, I'm really glad that you did, because I was thinking about it when Beatrice was talking as well. And I think you're so right that, yeah, then it's taking the fault away from the inner workings of her daughter's body and saying, she basically compares this pox, which has killed her daughter age 21, is very sad, to, I think it's like leaves scattered on a green, rose petals scattered on a green. So it's this sense of something that lands on top of the skin, but the skin itself, there's nothing kind of rising up through it. And yeah, I think it's one of those tricky things with skin. I think you're so right, Anna, about the internal external pressures, where maybe it's asking too much to ask for skin to be either or the other, in terms of being consistently always this surface that reflects the inside, or consistently always this completely, you know, immobile surface that just has stuff happen to it from the outside. And in terms of impressions, it makes you think about the different ways that a surface can be changed, in terms of not just being physically depressed and having that force imprint on it, but also having another layer added on top, I suppose, of these leaves or whatever, which maybe comes in a bit more, Vanessa, with book bindings. If you're gilding something, I guess, then you're adding like another very thin layer on top, as well as impressing it.
I had a question. I'd love to take that opportunity to throw a question at Beatrice, actually. I wanted to think more about, you know, the surface of skin, and what Arna was saying about the weird effacement of this process of scabbing and renewal and exfoliation, because we get theoretically another kind of animal skin in the Blazing World, and that's all the animal, but all we get are, you know, worm men, you know, fox men, a whole retinue of them. And it's, Beatrice, I wonder if you have thoughts on the visual effacement there, that, you know, we only get these names and we'd never get descriptions of any of them. And how does that shape, if at all, what skin is doing in the Blazing World?
Yeah, that's lovely. So I guess I talked a little bit. I'm just fascinated by the fact that the fullest example of embodiment we get is this sort of purgative, awful experience. And we don't see the sort of magical half hybrid creatures. And we don't see the imperial race who are so youthful and beautiful, that we just get this sort of unpleasant experience, which again, to me, because I'm thinking with Butler, is that it sort of points to like the inaccessibility ultimately and the alienness of these creatures. But at the same time, skin and flesh is ultimately always, I think, signifying animality, and it's always sort of a movement between the two. So I think it's lack, actually, when we get to the sort of scene of purgation, is a way of sort of breaking apart, of fracturing sort of the references to the animal, or making that sort of easy movement between the two. In that sort of particular instance, there's sort of a rejection of animality, is how I would read it there, because this creature, the imperial race, is set apart, because they're not, because only this particular part of the world has access to this. And I also just wanted to correct myself previously, because I just looked this up on OED. And yes, gums could mean the jaw and bases of the teeth as of like the 14th century. So I was wrong there.
No apologies necessary, Beatrice, but I do want to kind of make sure. I have the terrible job of telling us that we're almost done and we're almost out of time. But I want to make sure that anybody who didn't have a chance to speak up or raise a question or make a point gets a chance to right now. So I'm going to shut up. And someone else is going to take the floor if they so want to, who hasn't had a chance to speak.
So Arno, I can go ahead and share a question that was in the chat. This is for Lily. And I'll just read it too, because Sophie wrote it really well. Your point about the disease being a marking from without, not the virginal daughter's fault, makes me wonder if that's the same or the inverse logic that applies to, say, Desdemona's body being a page where whore is written. Is there an impression from male lovers without, or is that a corruption from within?
Thanks for this, Sophie. So do you mean is Desdemona?
Oh, please do, because I've been talking a lot. So Anna or Marina, Leanne, Miriam, Vanessa, Vanessa Rapat's, not Vanessa, our speaker.
I want to hear the answer to that question.
Okay.
I wish I had a brilliant answer to kind of blow you all away with for the final question, but yeah, I mean, is that an impression from male lovers without or a corruption from within? I mean, I guess the whole crux of the play is that he thinks it's the latter and then it turns out to be the former, right? So it switches, and it's about how unstable your perception is, which is something that just comes up constantly with skin, because it's like, is it from the outside? Is it from the inside? Is it makeup they've put on? Is it a real blush? You know, it's this constant thing. And then even when it's something from the inside, sometimes that can be artificially produced as well. Like even an authentic blush can be brought on by thinking on the right things, or there's even a distrust of that. So I guess what it really gets to the heart of is the difficulty of trust and of knowing someone else's like inner reality, really, whether that's through words or skin, which I think is like quite a similar relationship in that both can deceive, and then both can also sometimes bring you that little bit closer as well, even imperfectly.
Lily, I actually thought that was a brilliant way to end, the idea that you think that Othello thinks it's one and it's actually the other, and that the whole thing is a problem of misreading and of thinking that her body is dimensional, but it's actually sort of more flat. It's everything, all of the dichotomy is inverted. That's fantastic. I couldn't think of a better note to end on. So with that, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you so much to our panelists. You guys gave great papers. Please come back next week and the week after. We have Rogue Thoughts, which is on kind of mental illness and theories of mind. And then we have actually more mind, but specifically philosophy and gender the week after. So if that interests you, please come back. And yeah, send us follow-up questions. We'll see if we can get you in touch with the right people. We can send you these references from the chat. And again, just one more round of applause for Lily, Vanessa, and Beatrice. That was great.
And for Arnaud, Sophie, and Ian, you guys rock.
And again, we know that this is weird times of day for many of you, and we're really happy that you came anyway, and that it's a weekend, and you guys are the best. So thank you.